Welcome to the Lost in Translations podcast. This is your host, Michael, and this is episode 0, in which we test out the equipment and give you an introduction. It is here, or at least an introduction to this podcast. My name is Michael, and this is Lost in Translations, the podcast that explores literature from around the world. And I have been thinking about doing this podcast for about 6 months. I believe I started tweeting about it, and nothing really happened, except for David at the Populous gave me the name of Lost in Translations, and I thought it was perfect. We never got any further, and finally we are here to create episode 0, where we're just testing out the equipment and introducing the podcast. The aim for this podcast is to explore the world of literature and explore translation. I had struggled to find a podcast that talked about translated literature, so I finally reached the conclusion that I needed to make one, and this was kind of based on Toni Morrison's quote that says, if you can't find the book that you want to read, you have to write it yourself. And that's not the exact quote, but that's what I thought I had to do, and I have had to do this in the past. I discovered BookTube and I couldn't find the channels that I liked, so I had to create my own channel, and that's when I found all the BookTube channels that I really enjoyed watching. And maybe I will have the same experience with podcasts. I do know of a couple of podcasts that talk about translations. There's the 3% podcast, which is hosted by 3%, a resource in America that explores translations, and the name comes from the fact that only 3% of all publications in English are translations, and they just wanted to highlight those 3% because it is an amazing world of literature, and it is a world that I am in love with. I am still fairly new to this world as well. I have only just recently started going down the rabbit hole of translated literature, and this happened, I believe, 2 years ago when I discovered 50% of my reading was all American authors, and that was a little disconcerting because I am not an American, and while I tried to explore all types of literature, I realized that my problem was I was not exploring literature from around the world. So I started reading more, and I discovered how much I enjoyed it and how much I loved it. And there's something about books in translation that really stuck with me, and I've been working towards reading more and more. Last year I set a goal of reading 50% in translation, and I managed to hit that. And this year I believe I'm about 65, maybe close to 70%. I haven't checked lately, and this is really exciting. And while I don't want to be fully cutting off American literature or Australian literature or even UK or any other book written in English, I do feel like this is where my niche is. This is the books that I enjoy. So that's why I focused on translated literature, and that's why I started this podcast. I'm hoping to enjoy podcasting a little more than I did BookTube because I couldn't really feel comfortable. I don't feel like my personality came across in BookTube, and I'm hoping with this I have a better experience. And I am a book blogger as well, so some of you might know me as Knowledgelost on social media and the BookTube channel and the book blog, but for those who don't know me, I am fairly new to reading. I only discovered my passion for reading in 2009, and it was through a Australian radio station called Triple J, which I discovered it. They had these little segments called Culture Club, which was hosted by Craig Shufton, and he talked about art and how it related to music. And this would really interest me. I listened to all those little segments on SoundCloud, and then I realized that he had a book out. So me not being a reader, I sat down to read this book, and the book was Hey Nietzsche, Leave Those Kids Alone. And the idea was that modern music, especially bands like My Chemical Romance, Smashing Pumpkin and Weezer, share a lot of similarities to the Romantic period, and that sent me down a rabbit hole. And I picked up Frankenstein, and I absolutely loved that book, and this is the book that literally changed my life because I turned into a non-reader to a passionate reader, and I was wanting to absorb all that knowledge. I wanted to explore everything, but I didn't know where to go. So I turned to the 1001 books to read before you die, and I started reading books off that list, and I discovered some great literature. And then slowly but surely, I discovered that my interest lied in translations, and this is the type of books that I like. I like the philosophy, I like the political, I like to experience different cultures, and I feel like reading a book from a different country had that same effect that Frankenstein had, because I felt like I was learning something new, I was experiencing something I hadn't experienced myself, and it was giving me a fresh outlook. It was giving me fresh ideas. And that's why I read a lot of translations, because of that feeling. I am autodidactic. I am wanting to learn. I'm wanting to improve. And I feel like these books help me in that way. So this is why I love literature. This is why I love translations. And this is why I started Lost in Translations, the podcast. This is not really the format that I'm planning to stick with. This is just an introduction to introduce myself, to introduce the podcast, to test the equipment. And I thought I would do that and maybe talk about a couple of the book prizes that have just been announced recently, in particular the Man Booker International Prize, who recently gave us their shortlist. And it was an interesting list. The long list consisted of 6 women in translations. It was 5 female translators, and this is out of 13 books. 9 of those books were European authors, with Spain having the most books and Spanish being the most common language. There was 3 books from Spain and 4 books in Spanish. And this year I decided I'm going to try and read the long list, and I haven't read them all. I don't think I'll be able to get to them all, but I have been enjoying the experience. I have not enjoyed all the books, but the experience alone has been fun, and it's been fun to join in the conversation with other book bloggers that I love and some booktubers as well. And the idea is almost like a international book club where we are reading similar books and talking about similar books. And that's sort of like what I want to achieve in the podcast. The format that I'm planning to go with is to have a guest on and to talk about a specific book, and then maybe talk about some recommendations and other things we've loved, and keep it casual, keep it like a conversation, because I enjoy the podcasts that are more conversational, that don't try to be super professional. They just want to have fun and enjoy talking about literature. So at the time of recording, the Man Booker International Prize shortlist was announced, and that was 6 books made the list. 3 of them were women in translations, 3 female translators, though 1 book did have 3 different translators. So balance is still a little off, and the reason I bring this up is because when I say 3% books are translated into English, out of those 3%, only 30% are female authors. And I keep bringing up women in translation because I think that balance needs to be corrected, and there is a lot of great women in translations to read, and I think it's important to keep a little bit of a balance. And having said that, I will need to keep a bit of a balance with the different continents I read from, because like the shortlist, 4 of the 6 are from Europe. So there's a lot of books from South America and Africa and Asia that seem to be never mentioned. There's nothing on the long list or the short list from North America or Australia, and I don't know if you'd have any books from Antarctica, but there are some gaps, and I'm very aware of these gaps, and I'm trying to make sure I keep a better balance, especially with my own reading. And you'll probably hear me talk a lot about women in translation for that reason alone. Of the 6 longlisted for the Man Booker International, I have so far read 3 of the books. I have 2 books waiting to be read, and there's 1 still on its way. And the shortlist is Vernon Subtext, and this is by Virginie Despries and translated by Frank Wayne. And this is a French novel, and I do apologize for my pronunciations. I am going to get this wrong a lot of times, and I just want to apologize in advance. I am only fluent in English and barely fluent in that language, so I want to call out that this is going to be the most difficult part of doing a podcast, is pronouncing authors' names. And this book seems amazing, and I've read this author before, and she is very transgressive and very gritty. And while I didn't like the book I read, which was called Apocalypse Baby, I thought it was too transgressive for no reason at all. I think this one is going to be a little different because this one sounds like it has a purpose, and it definitely sounds like my type of book. It is about music, it is about life, and it is about being passionate about music. So I think I'll identify with this one. Second on the long list is The White Book by Han Kang, and this is translated from the South Korean by Deborah Smith. And this one, I'm a little unsure why it made the long list or the short list. I know Han Kang is a great writer, and I really enjoyed The White Book. I thought it was quite emotional, and it left an impact on me, but I don't think it's fiction. I think it's more essays and reflections on the colour white and grief. And I don't think it's poetry. I don't think it's fiction. And the Man Booker International Prize is supposed to be dedicated to translations of fiction, but I will talk a little bit more about the whole long list later. I'll just go through the short list first. The third book is The World Goes On by Laszlo Krasznahorkai, and he is a Hungarian author, and this is translated by multiple different people. I won't list them all, but I'll put them in the show notes. And this is a collection of thoughts, a collection of short stories. This is little fragments that sound like they are the start of something that he's working on, but they've just been collected into a book. And definitely not the best place to start with Krasznahorkai. And I am worried that people are going to read this book and never read him again, because this is a very weird place to start if you've never read him before. And I don't think I was even ready to read this one. I need to read more of his books before tackling this one. The fourth book on the shortlist is Like a Fading Shadow by Antonio Menez Molina, and this is a Spanish book that I have waiting for me. I got it from the library just a few days ago, and I'm really excited to read it. I don't know too much about it. I believe it's based on the killer of Martin Luther King and he fleeing to Spain, but that's all I know about it. Fifth on the list is Frankenstein in Baghdad by Hamid Shadoua, and this is translated by Jonathan Wright, and this is an Arabic novel from Iraq. And this one, I really enjoyed it. Kind of based on Frankenstein, but it's talking about the effects the Americans had on Iraq. And there are a lot of references to Frankenstein, which I really enjoyed. And I think it's a really great book because we get to learn about what's happening in Iraq from an Iraqi, because a lot of the stuff we hear is from America, and without knowing what the Iraqis think, we are getting one-sided information. And the last book is a Polish book called Flights, and it's by Olga Tokarczuk. And this is translated by the wonderful Jennifer Croft, and she is great. I follow her on Twitter, and I think she's a great translator. And I have this book waiting for me, but I have not read it, and I'm super excited to get to this one. I believe this will be the next book I read once I finish The 7 Functions of Language by Laurent Benet, which was translated from the French by Sam Taylor. This book I am loving, and I'm sad it's not on the short list. It's just my type of book. It has philosophy, it has literary criticism, and I think it's tailor-made for me. And a lot of people don't like it. Paradoxically, there are a lot of people that are comparing it to Dan Brown, and then the rest of the people that don't like it are calling it too pretentious. And I feel like those are two separate sides of a scale. But I am loving it, and I'm sad it's not on the shortlist, but I can understand why it was not put on the shortlist. The one I am sad that's not on the shortlist is called Die My Love, and this is by Ariane Harwicks, and this is a Spanish novel translated by Sarah Moses and Caroline Olaf. And I thought this was amazing, and this author is Argentinian, and I am finding that I am loving Argentinian writing. There are some great women from Argentina coming out with translations, and all their books seem amazing. Last year, a lot of people might have seen Fever Dreams, which was shortlisted for the Man Booker International Prize last year, and it seemed to do really well. It won the Tournament of Books in America, and everything I read from Argentina I seem to be enjoying. I'm sure there's some bad stuff, and maybe that's not been translated into English, but I would happily go down a rabbit hole of Argentinian literature and never come out. So the Man Booker International Prize feels very much like it consists of books that are unusual in their narrative structure and they blur the line between non-fiction and fiction. There are a few books there that I feel like are too much on the side of non-fiction to be classed as fiction books, and that's one of my biggest complaints about the list. But I have discovered some great books and I love these prizes because they do show me some books that I may not have considered reading, and they do encourage me to read those. The other long list that has been announced recently is the Best Translated Book Award, and this is created by 3%. I talked about their podcast before, and I won't go through the entire long list because that is 25 works of fiction and 12 works of poetry. But the reason why I'm bringing it up is because it is a very different list to the Man Booker International Prize. I have read two of the books on the fiction list, and that is Fever Dream, which I talked about before, and Savage Theories, which is also another Argentinian author. And from the list, there are 9 women in translations from the 25 fiction and 5 from the 12 in poetry. European authors seem to dominate the list again, and that's a little concerning, but it seems to be obvious. Spanish is still the most common language. And there's some interesting books in this list. There's so many I want to read, including a book from Madagascar, and it is the first book to be translated from the country into English. So that is pretty exciting. There's some interesting books in the poetry as well, and I am not much of a poetry reader, but I feel like I need to read more poetry, and I feel like I need to make an effort to do so. But I think there's some interesting books to be had there, including Iron Moon, which is a collection of poetry from Chinese migrant workers. And this is an anthology to explore their writing and a good introduction to Chinese poetry, I believe. Maybe when the shortlist is announced for the Best Translated Book Award, I will do an episode just talking about the shortlist and exploring how many I have read since then. Of all the books in the fiction section, I own 1, apart from the 2 that I've already read. And there is so much on that list that I have not heard of before, and I am excited by that because while I'm still fairly new in the world of translations, I feel like I'm starting to know more about the books that are being published and what looks good and what appeals to me. So having so many books that I have not heard of is pretty exciting. So that's the 2 prizes, and I just wanted to talk about them just because they are fairly recent, and while testing out my equipment, it seemed like a good idea to have a topic. And for podcasts in the future, I've mentioned that I will be talking about a specific book in each episode. I might do more episodes where I have a theme, maybe talking about a prize or talking about a genre or a subject. But for the most part, I hope to get a guest on here to talk about a book. And I won't tell you what the book is because that will spoil the fun. And my first guest will be my wife, and she's the producer of this podcast. So we will be uploading that episode probably soon. If you want to follow the podcast, we are all over social media at Translations Pod, and that's on Twitter, Instagram, Litsy, and Facebook. If you want to support the show, you can do so by visiting our Patreon page. We have a few different rewards there, but we're still going to flesh that out and probably offer more in the future once we got ourselves established and work out what we're trying to achieve and what we're doing. By the time I put this on social media, we should have our links all set up for Stitcher and iTunes, and hopefully that way you can subscribe and rate and review us. That would be awesome, and I think this will be an interesting journey, and I hope you come along with me as I discover more about translations, as I am forced to read books that I might not read. But the idea of this podcast is to show that books in translations are not always inaccessible, but they can be entertaining and exciting and can cover multiple genres. And I will spend some more time making sure that we are talking about women in translation because I am starting to get more and more passionate about it. At first, I just wanted to keep the balance, but the more I read, the more I wonder why these people aren't getting a voice. And when we talk about diversity, we often talk about different genders or different sexual orientation, but we hardly ever talk about different countries or different languages. So I'm hoping this will be a way to explore that for people that don't often try out books in translation. I hope I'm encouraging you to read more books in translation. So that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you subscribe, and if you do, leave a rating and review. Follow us on our social medias. All the links to the book should be in the show notes below, and read more books.